2 Samuel chapter 11 and chapter 12 offer perhaps one of the most vivid and informative illustrations concerning the nature and the consequences of sin in all the Bible. We're going to continue that study this morning by looking at 2 Samuel chapter 12. By way of review, since it was a couple weeks ago when we looked at chapter 11, we'll go back there and summarize what we learned from chapter 11. The very first verse of 2 Samuel chapter 11 tells us that David, at a time of the year when kings would typically go out to battle again, the return of the year, the spring of the year, that David stayed behind in his palace in Jerusalem. It seems that David was comfortable and David had become complacent. We noted that we're more susceptible to temptation when we're not where we ought to be and we're not doing what we ought to do. Instead of leading the army into battle, David remained in the comforts of the palace. Verse 2 tells us that there was one evening, he went out on the rooftop, he looked over toward the neighbor's house, and he saw a woman bathing. She was very beautiful. David's desire became a temptation. And we noted that temptation could have been resisted. And perhaps at that very moment, the instant he looked over and he saw this nude woman bathing, it would have been the easiest at that point in time to do something, to overcome, to endure, to escape that temptation. We noted 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse number 13. There, Paul tells us that God will not allow us to be tempted above that we're able, but also will with the temptation make also the way of escape, that ye may be able to endure it. With every temptation, there is an opportunity to endure, to escape, to overcome. What if the instant that David had looked over and seen this woman, that he turned around and he would have gone back inside and taken time to pray? What if he had worked on a psalm, one of those poems that he would write to worship God? We also noted, though, James chapter 1, verses 12 through 15, how lust becomes enticed and leads to sin, and sin ultimately leads to death. And that's what we see happen here. Instead of resisting, instead of taking the way of escape, David's lust is enticed. He dwells on it. I guess it would depend on where you lived and what kind of facilities you had. Yeah, at this point in time, the way some of these permanent structures were built, being out on the roof would offer, in the evening, the coolness, whereas if you're inside without air conditioning, that wouldn't be available.
She may not have been on the roof.
Right. But not necessarily. At least in her case, she was outside. David.
David was the one on the roof, Brendan.
According to what happened, it says here he was on the roof, but they'll say she was.
And where from his vantage point, he could look and see wherever she was. Right. Like I said, it would probably more be dependent on what kind of house you lived in, where you lived, concerning how you would bathe. Right. As David observed that, he allowed his mind to dwell on it. The lust becomes enticed, and he inquires. He pursues, who is this woman? And he's told that her name is Bathsheba. She is the wife of Uriah the Hittite. We're told in other places that this man Uriah was one of David's mighty men, one of his chief soldiers, someone that he could certainly trust. Not only does he ask who she is, he further sends messengers, and he has Bathsheba brought to the palace. They have sexual relations, and in the course of time, she sends word back that I'm with child. That presents a different problem for David. The husband, Uriah, at this point in time, he's on the battlefield. He's with General Joab. He's doing the work of a soldier. And so what we see in the verses that follow is David's attempt to conceal, to cover this up, to hide the matter as best he can. And what's tragic, Numbers 32, the last part of verse 23, be sure your sin will find you out. As far as God was concerned, David was already found out. God knew when that adultery took place. And we see David in these verses that follow here in 2 Samuel chapter 11 go to great lengths to try to cover it up, to try to conceal it, to try to hide it. Adultery under the law of Moses was a capital offense. It was appropriate, it was justified under the law for both David and Bathsheba to be put to death because of what they had done. And so we see David trying to hide it, conceal it as best he can. And how often is that the approach that so many people take to sin? It tells us something that David knew he had done something wrong, and yet he wasn't willing at this point in time to try to deal with it in the right way being God's way, like so many of us often do. He wanted to try to mitigate it, hide it, conceal it from others as much as he could. And so in the verses that follow, as David attempts to conceal and cover up, we see a vivid example of the compounding nature of sin. How sometimes we can lay sin upon sin. We can get deeper and deeper, further and further away from God without even knowing it. The first thing that David does, he recalls Uriah from the battlefield, and they have an interview. David asked him how things were going with the battle, and he sends Uriah to his house. Uriah, go home, be with your wife, and he even sends food, the king's food from the palace. Uriah, take this food, go home, enjoy the evening with your wife. The expectation was that it would be a conjugal visit, and the matter of the child could be explained that way. But Uriah, being a man of integrity, a man with a true soldier's heart, didn't go home. He stayed there outside the palace. David, well, what am I going to do now? So he brings Uriah back in and he asks him, why didn't you go home? You've had this journey, you've been away in battle. Why didn't you spend the evening with your wife? And Uriah tells him why. Joab, his fellow soldiers, they're all in the field. That's where I should be. I shouldn't enjoy the pleasures of home, the comforts of home, when I ought to be in the battle. So David says, Uriah, stay here another day, stay another night, and then tomorrow I'll send you back to Joab. That night, David and Uriah eat together, and David plies him with alcohol and gets him drunk. No doubt the expectation, the hope was that he would, this night, the second night, go home and be with Bathsheba. But still, he doesn't do that. David's attempt to conceal and to hide isn't working. Now what am I going to do? And we see this compounding nature of sin. That next morning he writes a letter to Joab, and he sends it by Uriah. He tells Joab, you set Uriah in the most fierce, the hottest part of the battle against this city, Rabbah, that you're besieging, you're trying to take, and then you pull back, you withdraw so that Uriah will be killed in this battle. Think for a moment on that night, some days ago, perhaps even weeks ago at this point, when David went out on his rooftop. Could he have ever imagined a scenario when he would do what he's doing now? When he would conspire to have one of his mighty men put to death in order to cover up something he had done wrong. And yet that's what he does. Joab does what David tells him to do. And yes, Uriah is killed in the battle. Message is sent back. The concern was that David would be angry, so Joab says, you make sure you tell David that Uriah, your servant, also is dead. And that message comes back to David. And as chapter 11 ends, after the period of mourning for her husband, Bathsheba is brought into the palace to be the wife of David. But the very last sentence of chapter 11. But the thing that David done displeased Jehovah. As far as David was concerned, as difficult as it was in all the things he had tried, in his mind, as the account in chapter 11 closes, he thinks that he's been successful. At least the question of this child, there was an answer for. Uriah's gone, and now Bathsheba is my wife. So he thinks that he's concealed this, he's covered it up, he's kept it a secret as much as possible. But God knew, and God was angry. God was upset. And that's where chapter 12 begins. Chapter 12 begins with Nathan telling David a parable. We call this parable the parable of the little ewe lamb. Many Bible students, when we think of parables, we think of the stories that Jesus told that are recorded for us in the Gospels. They are stories that are true to life, things that happen in everyday life or things that could happen. But those things from everyday life were told to make a spiritual application. They were told to illustrate a spiritual truth. And that's one of the reasons Jesus taught so often in parables. To give his listeners something they were familiar with, something they could relate to, and use that to illustrate a spiritual truth. Teach a spiritual principle. Allow them to make an application of truth with perhaps not even realizing that the application is being made to themselves. And that's what we find here. Nathan is going to tell David this little story, but it has an application. There's a spiritual truth to be emphasized. And with this story, David realizes the truth. David makes an appropriate application. And then Nathan tells him, David, this truth, this application you made, it applies to you. So let's go to chapter 12 and read these first few verses, the parable of the little ewe lamb. And Jehovah sent Nathan to David, and he came unto him and said unto him, there were two men in one city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had exceeding many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing, save one little ewe lamb, which he had bought and nourished up. And it grew up together with him and with his children. It did eat of his own morsel and drank of his own cup, and lay as his bosom, and was unto him as a daughter. And there came a traveler unto the rich man, and he spared to take of his own flock and of his own herd, to dress for the wayfaring man that was coming to him, but took the poor man's lamb and dressed it for the man that was come to him. And David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. And he said to Nathan, as Jehovah liveth, the man that hath done this thing is worthy to die. And he shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing, and because he had no pity. A rich man who had great wealth measured in many sheep and his many flocks of sheep, a great herd of cattle, contrasted with a poor man in that same city. Nathan says that poor man didn't have anything except one little female lamb that he had bought. as a pet. He ate his food, she ate his food, slept in the bed with him. Very dear, very precious as a pet. A visitor comes to visit the rich man. He had so many cattle, so many sheep, he could take in any one of those to prepare a meal for his visitor. But instead, he takes that little ewe lamb from the poor man, and that becomes the meal for his visitor. David's incensed concerning this case that Nathan brings before him. How could this rich man do this? He's very angry. He says he's worthy of death, not meaning that what this rich man had done was a capital offense. Stealing a sheep wasn't a capital offense, but literally this man is a son of death, meaning he was a very bad man. He was an evil man. How could he be so despicable? How could he be so evil to take this little pet lamb from this poor man when he had so much that he could offer his visitor? He's a bad man, David says. He's evil. He's a son of death. And then notice the sentence that David passes. It illustrates for us that David was well acquainted with the law of Moses. I want to read to you Exodus chapter 22 and verse number 1. Exodus 22 and the very first verse. If a man shall steal an ox or a sheep and kill it or sell it, he shall pay 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. So the sentence that David passes is what the law of Moses called for. If a man steals an oxen from someone else and he kills it or he sells it, then restitution is to be made. For that ox that's been taken, 5 oxen needs to be given to the one it was stolen from. If someone steals a sheep, then the restitution demanded under the law of Moses was 4 sheep be returned. David knew the law of Moses. He knew thou shalt not commit adultery. He knew that adultery and murder were capital offenses. He was quick to apply the law in this case that Nathan brings before him. And it illustrates something else about the nature of sin. How so many times it's so easy for us to see sin in others and make an appropriate application. David knew what that rich man had done was wrong, and he knew what God required to be done. He knew the restitution that needed to be made. He could very easily, in this instance, make proper application. And yet, here he's committed adultery, gone to great lengths to cover it up, even to the point of conspiring to have a just man, as well as others, innocent people, put to death. How easy is it for us to look at someone else and be able to point out their failings, their sins, and their shortcomings. When all the while, there's application to be made personally. I can't help but think about those Pharisees that Jesus often interacted with during his earthly ministry. How they were self-righteous, and how time after time they went against him, trying to find something against the only sinless one that's ever lived. All the while, in their self-righteousness, thinking they were justified. But so ready and so willing to try to condemn Jesus and his disciples. Verse number 7 is the lightning strike of truth, the application. Not to the rich man that stole the little ewe lamb, but to King David himself. Verse number 7, and Nathan said to David, Thou art the man. Thus saith Jehovah, the God of Israel, I anointed thee king over Israel, and I delivered thee out of the hand of Saul. I gave thee thy master's house and thy master's wives into thy bosom, and gave thee the house of Israel and of Judah. And if it had been too little, I would have added unto thee such and such things. David, I made you the king. I anointed you to be king over Israel, to protect them, to shepherd them, to lead them into battle against their enemies. I protected you from Saul, and what is his came under your control. You have the kingdom. And if even that had not been enough, then I would have added this and this and this to it. David, you're the rich man. I've blessed you abundantly. How could you have done what you've done? Verse 9. Wherefore hast thou despised the word of Jehovah, to do that which is evil in his sight? Thou hast smitten Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and taken his wife, Uriah's wife, his wife, to be thy wife, and hast slain him with the sword of the children of Ammon. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from thy house, because thou hast despised me, and hast taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be thy wife. David, you've sinned greatly in taking Bathsheba to be your wife and in having Uriah killed. In doing that, you've despised me. You've despised my word. In verse number 10, there's one of the consequences that's going to come of all this. God, through Nathan, tells David the sword will not depart from your house. You're going to face violence within your own family. That's going to be one of the consequences. Verse 11. Thus saith Jehovah, Behold, I will raise up evil against thee out of thine own house. And I will take thy wives before thine eyes, and give them unto thy neighbor. And he shall lie with thy wives in the sight of this son. For thou didst it secretly, But I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. Continued violence would be a consequence. Evil against David from his own house would be a consequence. The next chapter, chapter 13, and then continuing through chapter 18, we see these things fulfilled. To me, it's quite interesting that the judgment that David gave in the law of Moses, that 4 sheep to be returned for 1 sheep, as a result of what David has done, as things unfold, there are 4 of his sons that will die an untimely death. This child that Bathsheba had, we see here in chapter 12 that he dies. David has another son, Amnon. One of his brothers, Absalom, puts Amnon to death. That whole sordid thing's recorded for us in the next chapter, chapter 13. Absalom rebels against David. Absalom, David's own son, tries to take the throne. And ultimately, it's General Joab that kills Absalom. And then another son, Adoniah. He will die through the order of Solomon, who succeeds David to the throne. Another son that Bathsheba bore to him. Violence from your own house. Wives taken from you and given to another. As Absalom tries to usurp the monarchy and take the throne, that's one thing Absalom does. That's fulfilled in his son Absalom. Verse 12, you did it in secret, but these things will be done openly. Verse number 13, David acknowledges his sin. I wonder what would have happened if Nathan had walked in and immediately condemned what David had done. He told him that story to allow David to apply and understand the truth. But what if Nathan had come in and said, David, you committed adultery, you shouldn't have taken Bathsheba, it was a sinful thing in what you did with Uriah. I wonder how David would have reacted. Would he have put Nathan to death? Most kings in history, most kings certainly in David's day, would have done that. But Nathan gets David to understand the application, the wrongfulness of what had happened, and said, David, you're the man. Even at that point, how many will still resist and still reject and still fight against what God has said? But to his credit, showing the sincerity of his heart, showing the tenderness of his heart, David confesses to Nathan, I have sinned against Jehovah. a very simple confession, a very simple statement here that's amplified for us in the 51st Psalm. And we're going to take some time next week to look at that 51st Psalm, because there David expands upon this simple confession that's recorded for us here. Here it's simply recorded, I have sinned against God. The 51st Psalm, he pours out his heart in a poetic plea for pardon. Verse 13, and David said unto Nathan, I have sinned against Jehovah. Nathan said unto David, Jehovah also hath put away thy sin. Thou shalt not die. As far as David being put to death for adultery, for his conspiracy to have Uriah murdered, Nathan has this word from God. David, God's put away the sin from you. You're not going to die because of that. Verse 14, howbeit, because by this deed thou hast given great occasion to the enemies of Jehovah to blaspheme, the child also that is born unto thee shall surely die. And Nathan departed into his house. David, God's put the penalty away from you. You're not going to die. But the penalty in this instance is going to be borne by this child. He's going to die. And there's something there in that verse that we need to recognize and we need to think about. What did Nathan say had happened because of David's sins? You've given occasion for the enemies of Israel to blaspheme. What happens when a Christian sins? We give occasion for the enemies of our Lord and for the enemies of the church to blaspheme. One of Satan's greatest allies is the hypocrite in the Lord's church. How often is that used as an excuse? We're trying to get someone to understand that they need to repent. They need to obey the gospel. How many times is this retort given? But what about so-and-so? What about this person that's there in the pew, in your congregation, every Sunday morning, and then he opens his business on Monday morning, and he cheats, and he lies, and he steals? When we sin, one of the consequences is that we give occasion to the enemies of the church to blaspheme. That's what David had done. David, as king in his position, as this became known and as the consequences were faced, the occasion for the enemies of Israel to blaspheme would be magnified. Those who preach and teach, serve as elders, those who are looked up to in the community as leaders in the church need to be especially mindful of their personal conduct. None of us is perfect. We all fall short. But when we sin, this is one of the consequences. There's that opportunity for someone to blaspheme, to speak against the church. Does it justify the one that won't obey the gospel? No. They're accountable before God for their life and what they do. But when we sin, we ought to remember this consequence. The last part of verse number 15, Jehovah struck the child that Uriah's wife bare unto David. It was very sick. David therefore besought God for the child, and David fasted and went in and lay all night upon the earth. The elders of his house arose and stood beside him to raise him from the earth, but he would not, neither did he eat bread with them. And it came to pass on the seventh day that the child died. And the servants of David feared to tell him the child was dead. For they said, Behold, while the child was yet alive, we spake unto him, and he hearkened not unto our voice. How will he then vex himself if we tell him the child is dead? David is fasting, he's praying, he's hoping that somehow God will allow this child to live. He's cut himself off, he won't have anything to do with the servants, and now this child's dead. His servants are wondering, how's he going to react now? He's been in such a state of mourning already. What is he going to do when we tell him that the child is dead? But when David saw that his servants were whispering together, David perceived that the child was dead. And David said unto his servants, Is the child dead? And they said, He is dead. Then David arose from the earth and washed and anointed himself and changed his apparel. And he came into the house of Jehovah and worshipped. Then he came to his own house, and when he required, they set bread before him, and he did eat. Then said his servants unto him, What thing is this that thou hast done? Thou didst fast and weep for the child while it was alive, but when the child was dead, thou didst rise and eat bread. And he said, While the child was yet alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, Who knoweth whether Jehovah will not be gracious to me, that the child may live? But now he is dead, wherefore should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he will not return to me. A passage that's sometimes used today in funerals. And David says, the reason I was fasting and mourning was in the hopes that somehow God would allow this child to live. But now that he's dead, there's nothing I can do about that. He can't return, but I will go to him. David may have simply meant that as this child is done now, there will be a time that I will also leave this earth. But for us as Christians, with the full revelation of the gospel, the full expectation and the hope of heaven, these are indeed words of comfort. We'll go to a better place. We need to stop here this morning. Read, as you have time this coming week, chapters 13 through 18. The consequences that are mentioned here in chapter 12, we see those things come about. But then we're going next Sunday morning to go to the 51st Psalm. Here David says, I have sinned. That's expanded upon in the 51st Psalm. So that's what we'll study next Sunday morning.